This is the I Read Comic Books podcast, and I am your host for this week's episode, Paul Jasley, filling in for the uncanny Mike Rappin as he enjoys a much-deserved, relaxing honeymoon vacation in Japan. We're here holding the fort down with two fantastic comic book friends, Nick White.
Hey.
And Rene Rodriguez.
I wouldn't go so far as fantastic, but hey.
You know, you're your own harshest critic, Rene. I say you're fantastic, so accept it.
All right. Thanks, Paul.
You're Mr. Fantastic in my book. Rene Rodriguez and Reed Richards. See RRRR. See, maybe there's a connection there.
All right.
We're establishing.
It's canon now.
That's canon. RCB canon. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining me. Things are a bit loose, of course. Mike's not here. The inmates are running the asylum, so to speak. But as the host, with that weight, that responsibility, I have two questions to ask both of you. How have you been? How have comic books been? Let's start with you, Rene.
Comic books have been great, honestly. I've been reading way too much because I forgot that I was subscribed to Kindle Unlimited. And so there's just a bunch of free stuff just on there. Also, that does explain that charge that I keep getting. So, yeah, you know, right. Two birds, one tablet. And so I was reading a lot, but then I also just happened to go to Vault of Midnight yesterday when I was in Grand Rapids. So I picked up Monster Volume 4 by Naoki Urasawa, and the series is so good. It's super intense, but it is so good. And I really only get one volume at a time, which feels like a mistake, but at the same time, my bank account is probably grateful that I didn't just buy the whole series in one dump.
How many volumes are we talking for this manga? I mean, upward of 3 digits? Or
No. I think it's actually only... I don't even think it goes up to 10. I could be wrong.
Oh, okay. Sure.
So it's not that... I mean, the volumes are pretty big.
Okay, I see.
So they kind of... The volumes kind of have that, like, 2-in-1, 3-in-1 feel, but it is just, like, this is how big the volume is. And it's... So, I mean, it's a good read, but the series is so good that when you get done with the volume, you're like, I should have grabbed another one. It's just, I want to know, because it's just this one overarching story. They aren't just like, it's not like little throwaway, like one chapters, like everything is connected to this bigger story, and it's really kind of amp it up. And I'm only on volume 4. I don't even think I'm halfway through the series. I think I'm almost there, but it's a thing. And then the other book I read was the newest volume of Fire Force by Atsushi Okubo. And I really got into the series because I was curious, because it's about, like, firefighters with special powers, and I was like, well, what kind of a powers would a firefighter have? And it's... The whole series is a riot, but, like, in a really, like, a good riot. Like a, right. Riot at a...
Not a scary prison riot.
Yeah, no, riot, like, at a punk show, not, like, riot in the streets. And it's from the creator of Soul Eater. If you guys have heard of that or something, the anime was really big a while ago, and that's a good series. So this is the same writer, and it's been a really fun story. It really doesn't stop. It just kind of hits the ground running, and then just jumps into the sky with a fiery burst and says, "Bring it on!" So it's been fun. And then also when I picked up the volume yesterday, the clerk and I had a nice conversation about it. And I think we became friends, even if just for that moment. So
sometimes that's the most important connection you can make is, friendship over a comic book purchase.
Oh yeah, most definitely.
Yeah. Maybe I totally missed this part, Rene, but what's the 20-second summary of this book?
Oh, so Monster is about a doctor that he's a Japanese doctor who lives in Germany during when it separated into East and West Berlin, or East and West Germany, sorry. And he is trying to make his way up in this very prestigious hospital when he has to make the choice between saving a young boy or a politician, and he decides to save the young boy instead. And then that young boy grows up to be a serial killer. And now the doctor is trying to fix his mistake.
Yeah, sorry, the moment you said making his way, all I could think of was the Vanessa Carlton song, 1,000 Miles.
Sure.
But Yeah, okay. I think Mike's raved about this book before.
I mean, most definitely.
Yeah.
I think he's read the whole series. I don't remember. I'd have to talk to him about it. But it's really good. It's super good. Lots of really interesting tie-ins to the time as well.
Okay.
Fans of history take note.
Or doctors. Fans of doctors take
Yeah,
note.
if you're into neuroscience or criminology or even child psychology, this is the book for you. Also, if you're into the actual definition, like the whole argument of is there actually evil or is it just something that we've fictitiously created? So, I mean, that's all that. This is a really good
Rene,
story.
I don't need these serious things in my comic books. My comic books are just... No, I'm just kidding. I hate that argument's bullshit.
I was reading this last night, and I just had this thought. I was like, because I know that there's a live-action TV series that they made for it in Japan, or maybe it was in Korea. I don't remember. But I know that there's a live-action series or movie for it, and they had the anime, and I've actually seen like people talk about it, and they're like, even though those adaptations are really good, they really don't compare to the pacing and the style of the manga. And like as I was flipping through it, I was like, it would be really hard to try and adapt this to get that same kind of eerie feeling that is just throughout the series. And so I highly recommend it. It's super good.
I thought the
That sounds
adaptations
appealing.
normally like knock it out of the park, Renee. I mean, don't people love that Netflix Death Note movie? Like,
I will literally go over to your house and physically fight you.
guys, we're gonna have to take a break. Renee's coming over here right now.
How dare you?
Rejoin.
This is why.
We'll rejoin the podcast while the fight is in progress.
This is why I'm making you read Death Note, Nick.
Nick, let's get off that topic before it comes to
Blows.
blows, figurative or literal. Yeah. What have you been reading, Nick? How have you been?
Things have been okay. I feel like Michigan finally figured out it's fall now, which is fine. That's fine. I'm okay with that. Mm-hmm. I've been slowly kind of learning everything that the library has to offer in terms of, all the different crazy, it's if you like stop and go to the website, they're like, oh, by the way, like you can now log in and use the Consumer Reports website for free, and you can use this Ancestry website for free, and all this other crazy stuff. And it's sort of, I can't believe they're just handing. I mean, I understand why people have problems with libraries. They're just handing away stuff for free all the time. It's just that doesn't sound like capitalism to me. So I hate it.
Yeah. You hear it first, folks. Nick hates libraries.
Yeah, but speaking of libraries, I did check out Copperhead Volumes 1 and 2 from Image Comics, written by Jay Farber, I think. Scott Godlewski on pencils, Ron Riley on colors, Thomas Maurer on letters. So this is a series that began from Image in 2014. Currently has 4 TPBs and 19 issues out. It kind of is in a bit of a holding position until the team isn't preoccupied with other projects right now, because it's supposed to hit 22 issues and then wrap. But these are the perils, I guess, of buying into a creator-owned series, right? You never know when or if they're going to take these little breaks, and But so Farber wrote for CW's Ringer, CBS's Zoo. He also writes elsewhere for Image. Godlewski pretty much made his big splash with Copperhead, but has kind of parlayed that into that success into work at DC. Riley has just worked on other Farber books. So the series is a space western, and it follows Sheriff Clara Bronson and her son Zeke, who have moved to Copperhead for a quote-unquote fresh start. That's code for we'll find out who's chasing them in 2 trades. If you're wondering if Copperhead is a place you want to be, when you inherit the uniform of your dead predecessor, your deceased predecessor, bullet holes and all, because they can't buy you a new one because of budget cuts, that pretty much tells you everything you need to know. I thought that was a nice touch. It kind of both informs you on the police budget as well as how much fun it is to be a law enforcement officer in Copperhead. Some characters are pretty unique and interesting. There's basically a redneck family of Mike Wazowskis. If you made them about 2.5 feet taller and had them basically all wearing tank tops. Okay. Other characters are pretty archetypey for a space western. You've got the evil Colonel Sanders, Southern drawl looking dude who's a smooth talking motherfucker, and he owns a mine. And I'm sorry, but you don't get to own a mine and be a good guy. Like, anyone who's out there looking for, when they said, like, whatever Shakespeare said, there's only 7 real narratives, there's an 8th, and it's a good guy who owns a mine. So if you're looking for that 8th one that really hasn't been tapped, no mine puns intended here, if you write a story about a good guy who owns a mine, I think that's it. I've cracked the code. All right, that's it. Yeah. We're done, everyone. Let's close the show. I mean, beyond that, yeah, it's just a lot of archetypes. You have the deputy whose name is Bud Roxaphinicus, who just goes by Boo for short. Thank God. Why is this book just a whole bunch of names I'm going to get wrong? And of course, he was used to being the sheriff before Clara rolled into town, and now he has to begrudgingly take on the role of the deputy. And will they work together? Won't they work together? Will there be some sort of a begrudging friendship over time? Of course there will. Of course there will. It's got to follow the stereotypes of the genre. It does like sort of play with other tropes, like the town having to round together a posse to go take on this other bad guy, and you have the whole trope of the sheriff goes on a date with the school teacher, except in this case the sheriff is a woman and the school teacher's a man, so there's a nice little inversion there, I guess. But ultimately, yeah, it's pretty tropey, but it's fun. I enjoyed it. Yeah, I would recommend this to other people. The pencils kind of oddly remind me of Martin Morazzo's work on Ice Cream Man for some reason. Yeah, let me see. That pretty much wraps it.
I remember this getting a lot of praise when it first came out, and it's one of those books that was filed away in the back of my mind to check out one of these days. So thanks for reminding me about it.
Yeah. I mean, the world building, I'd say, is well paced and organic. There's sort of a slow burn going on here. I'd recommend it. It's easy to say like it sort of checks all the boxes for space western, but I feel like in a lot of ways, once you say you're doing a space western, you've kind of already sort of put yourself in the box anyway, I guess.
Yeah.
What a thing to say about space westerns when they're so weird, but it's like at the same time they're all weird in the exact same kind of way.
Right. I mean, exactly. It's kind of unfair to be like, oh, it seems like they sort of checked all the boxes, but it's like when you already say I'm doing space western, you've already sort of made a real niche there to begin with. And most of the people that like space western, they're all just trying to chase that Firefly high anyway. They don't care.
I disagree because I like space westerns and I fucking hate Firefly.
All right, fine. Renee's in that 2% category. Great. Duly noted, Rene. Your dissent has been recorded for the record.
Oh, if I actually get a bunch of hate for Firefly, I will actually be like super happy.
You might.
Well, you know where to contact us. So, listeners, if you have some Firefly related hate,
that's the thing. I always say, I was like, if you want to talk to me, even throwing shade at me, I'm totally fine with it. And nobody ever does, which I feel like I'm a little disappointed.
I feel this is a big gauntlet being thrown down with the Firefly dismissal.
I mean, here's the thing. I've tried to watch Firefly. I've tried like 4 separate times, and I just can't get into it.
I'm right there. Renee, I'll let you in a little secret. I'm right there with you. I made it 3 episodes and gave up.
Dude, same!
Anyway. What about you, Paul? Yeah. What have you read? How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Yes, I think we're all... I'm enjoying the short autumn period we're having here in West Michigan. Hopefully it lasts a bit longer than usual. But in terms of comic books, I know it's my duty as the host of the show, filling in for Mike Rappin. I have to talk about X-Men #1. I did buy it. I did read it. that's just who I am now. You know, I'm an X-Men fan. It feels weird to say it out loud,
what I am.
but here I am.
Trash.
Exactly, X-trash. No, I really enjoyed Hox Pox for all that it was, and I liked the fact that Hickman was able to craft a big world-building story that spoke to me as a new fan, or a relatively, you know, not well-versed X-Men fan, and someone like Mike who's very well-versed. I think it worked for us for different reasons, but the fact we both enjoyed the book, I think that speaks to what Hickman was doing there.
It appears the only person it didn't speak to was Rob Liefeld, I guess.
Oh, did he have some comments about that?
Apparently he went off the rails a few days ago, so you'll have to take a look into that.
Oh, yeah, I can't wait to hear what Rob says. Anyway, X-Men #1. Jonathan Hickman's writing it. Lionel Francis Yu is on art, with Gary Allen Guilin on inks and Sonny Go on colors. This is the big launch of the new X-Men thing, the new status quo, and it felt very much like an X-Men book. It felt more like an X-Men comic than the Hoxpox stuff did, because this was kind of the quiet period after all the world building where most of the issue is people getting together at Cyclops' house and having dinner and long conversations. I mean, I know that's kind of an X-Men trope, with just a lot of characters talking, you know, thanks, Chris Claremont. But I guess that's part of what the book is, and I guess that's what I have to expect for what I'm have to expect. But I actually really enjoyed it. I think what Hickman's doing, you know, Hoxpox left the status quo in a weird place, I think, where there's a lot of questions to be answered. And obviously that's what the, I think, 6 ongoing books spinning out of it are going to address. But there is something unsettling about the status quo. Like, there's something, you know, the X-Men are uncanny. There's something I can't quite put my finger on about this. And it's interesting that Cyclops especially, and some of the other established characters don't seem to be bothered by the ethical questions or problems raised by Magneto and Xavier's plan. That might be mild spoilers for Hoxpox, but I guess anyone who wants to read it has already read it at this point. But I'm really stunned that feels like there's a huge, the other shoe's going to drop at some point, just a matter of when. And it makes the book very suspenseful in a not an obviously suspenseful way. Does that make sense? Whereas the characters seem to be acting out of character. I'm like, don't you have a problem with what's going on? But they never seem to address it. And they're either willfully or not ignoring these major issues that are raised by the new status quo. So I guess that's sort of my way of doing a non-spoiler recap of Hoxpox.
I noticed there was some grade A tiptoeing going on there, Paul.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure anyone who's read it will probably roll their eyes into the back of their head to the point that they'll have to go to urgent care when I ask this. But being someone who is not privy to any of this, I still have to ask for the people, the listeners, if you didn't read Hoxpox, can you read this book, or is it pretty much assumed you're going into this having read Hoxpox? House of X, Powers of 10 is definitely a prologue to this. It's, you know, it feeds into it in a pretty major way. Okay. It's going to be a real uphill battle if you don't.
I would say so.
Okay.
Based on, you know, and I think that miniseries, but also the 2 miniseries also establish a sort of aesthetic vibe that plays into this as well. I mean, it's a Jonathan Hickman comic. There are data pages that read like Wikipedia entries and stuff. There's a lot of, you know, background being built into it that I think you'd miss if you skip that mini to get to this. So I wouldn't recommend it to skipping right to X-Men #1. Even though first issue should stand on its own, I'm not sure if this one does.
I was going to say, I'm kind of confused because Xavier's alive again, and so is Cyclops?
Yeah.
Gordon's alive?
They're back.
Sorry.
I don't know who Gordon, I don't know what that reference is to.
Flash Gordon, the movie.
Jeez, first
Paul,
Bonanza,
right,
now Flash Gordon.
Yeah, Nick, you're really sort of aging our demographic here. So let's get to what the kids are into. Let's talk about Judge Dredd. The other book I read this week was Judge Dredd, The Small House, and regular listeners will probably remember that I've been very slowly making my way through the Judge Dredd complete case files, which collect all the Judge Dredd stuff from all the way back to the late 70s. Just finished volume 5, so that's the slow pace that I'm on. But this is actually a more recent Dredd story. This collects a story from 2018, last year, and then a couple short prologue story from 2016 that leads into it. It's written by Rob Williams and art by Henry Flint, who have become a sort of major contemporary Dredd creative team. And this book, this story, The Small House, really ties together a lot of the ideas that they've introduced into the Dredd mythos over the past decade. And it's really interesting because I think, Nick, you and I have talked about this on the podcast, that what makes Judge Dredd so fascinating is the fact it's a 40-year continuity that's never been rebooted or retconned.
The aging in real time thing, yeah.
Yeah. And so you have events that are still being referenced. So like in this book, there's a character that is talking to Dredd and says, Dredd, Mega City 1 survived because of what you did during the day the law died, during the Apocalypse War. Like, you fought off Judge Death. Like, all these classic stories are still part of the whole story here. And this book actually fundamentally changes a couple of those stories. You find out new revelations about those stories that are like 35 years old. It's pretty amazing. But the sort of main plot here is that Dredd is overseeing a small team of judges who are investigating the assassination of political leaders or pro-democracy leaders around the world. And the thing is that Judge Dredd is sort of operating this covert team without the explicit knowledge of the chief judge. So he's kind of bending the rules a little bit himself, which is interesting for Dredd because he plays by the book more than anybody, and he gets called out on that. So, and then along the way, he realizes that the person behind these assassinations, played a role in major events in Mega City 1 in the past. And it really changes the context of the Apocalypse War, which is a story from like 1982. You know what I mean? Like, It completely changes the way Judge Dredd feels about that event. To be able to do that, that's some pretty amazing heavy lifting. And I think that really like fundamentally changes the character and Mega City 1 in a really interesting way. The fact that they're able to do that with a 40-year-old character without really having to reboot him, so to speak, is pretty amazing. It's a really, really good story. And I would say this is something that, even if you haven't read those classic Dredd stories, this is a really solid standalone Dredd story. It's a really good character study. They do enough work to kind of explain the background of the stuff. I think you could enjoy it if you picked it up without having much knowledge of Dredd. But if you do, it's a much deeper, more satisfying, read. But I highly recommend this. I absolutely love this book. I'm actually pretty excited to go back and reread it after I've read a few more volumes of the complete case file, see if there's even more connections that I'm missing on this first read.
Is this technically an IDW, or is this a 2000 AD?
2000 AD, and Nick, you're going to hate it because the 2000 AD trade collection is a bigger size than a traditional comic book, so it's not going to fit in your long box if you pick it up. So,
oh no,
no, I think that this book got so much praise when it came out. The story that I think 2000 AD basically fast tracked it to a trade collection. So it came out a few weeks ago, and I pre-ordered it when I saw it was coming up because I heard so much praise, and it deserves all the praise it's getting. It's a fantastic Dredd story, so I'm very pleased that I read it.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So those were the comics that were. Let's talk about future comics. These are the books we're excited about this upcoming Wednesday, October 23rd. Nick, let's start with you. What are you excited for this week?
For me, it would probably have to be the fact that the first trade of Invisible Kingdom is coming out. This is a series from Dark Horse Comics, more specifically the Berger Books imprint, which unsurprisingly is named after the fact that it's sort of a curated thing by editor Karen Berger, previously of Vertigo, no longer a thing, obviously, so that's a deal. So this is written by G. Willow Wilson. I haven't read much of her stuff. Obviously, she's gained a lot of praise for Miss Marvel, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. That's a Marvel book, I guess. I don't know. I don't hang out on that side of the fence. But sometimes people like fold up paper airplanes and throw them over the fence, and I gather reports about Marvel that way, basically. Yeah. But the big thing for me is that Christian Ward is on art. That alone should be enough for most people. You could say, Nick, Christian Ward is drawing a book. And I'd be like, fine, I'll read it. They'd be like, don't you want to know what it's about? Don't you want to know who's writing it? No, doesn't matter.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Christian Ward is drawing it. I'm sure it will be beautiful. Worst case scenario, it becomes a fantastic coffee table book. End of story. But for those who are curious, it's the story of two women in a distant galaxy, which according to the press junket summary is one's a fighter pilot, the other's a religious acolyte, and together they're going to uncover a conspiracy connecting the galaxy's dominant religion and corporation. So we're just checking every single box from politics to religion to conspiracy theories to science fiction. I think everyone would probably be on board with this book. So what's funny is, of course, it sounds so much like a book that you would get at Image, but it's actually over at Dark Horse. So that's good on them, I suppose.
Yeah, I remember this, when this came out, getting praise as well. So I filed it away in my memory to check out. I haven't read much G.Well Wilson stuff either, but this might be the book to check out, especially since you have, Christian Word artwork to look at as well. So
yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. Rene, what are you excited for this week?
Well, Paul, I'm excited for One Piece.
Okay.
I'm always excited for One Piece. Even the weeks where it's not coming out, I'm still always excited for it. Especially right now, chapter 959, for those keeping score. We're in the middle of the Wano arc. It's Wano Act 3. Bam! Very, very exciting. We've been waiting for this arc for a long time, and I know I've talked about this before, and now we're kind of in the middle. And Eiichiro Oda, the writer of One Piece, is stylizing this entire arc kind of after a kabuki play. So it's the speculation is that it's going to have about 5 acts, and we're on Act 3, and it just started. And it's just, there's a lot of twists and turns, and a lot has already happened in this arc. And it just seems like it's just going to get better and better. So, One Piece. Always One Piece.
There you have it, folks.
Yep.
There you have it, folks. One Piece. I've heard of it. I don't. Is this a good jumping on point? Chapter 959.
Look, here's the thing. Everyone's always really kind of scared. They're like, "Oh man, that's over 900 chapters. Each chapter's only 20 pages long, guys. Okay, that's not a lot."
So it's like jumping onto Action Comics number 959, like a few years ago. Right?
I guess. But here's the difference though, is that One Piece is a very big series, but you can still find volume number 1 at Barnes and Noble at a comic book shop.
Right.
And here's the thing, it is a very good story, and you do want to read all of it. There's the depth in all the characters, and I do mean all the characters, is amazing. The storytelling is done brilliantly, and here's the thing. You, want to read a story, and then you're like, oh, man, it's over, or oh, no, I've caught up, or something like that after 10 issues, or after 1 volume. Here's the thing. There's 959 chapters, all of them available on Viz if you have their yearly subscription, only $25 for the whole year. Anyways, plug done. But
I feel like following that, we need to do a Squarespace ad. After Rene gave that, we need to. This has to be followed with Squarespace.
The thing is, you can read all those chapters.
Yeah.
Granted, you can't do it all in one day because they have a 100 chapter a day limit, which is dumb.
Wow.
But here's the thing: there is so much to read. You don't have to sit down and digest it all in one day. But at the same time, knowing that you're not going to just hit this wall, it's not just going to suddenly end. That's kind of comforting, I think.
No, yeah. I'm kind of kidding a little bit. Some of my favorite comics are ones that are 35, 40 years long, like Love and Rockets and Judge Dredd, and I think it's important to go back and read all that stuff. So who knows? One of these days, maybe I'll jump on One Piece. I'll buy, when they do the special, issue 1000, I'll jump on, right?
I mean, Paulie, if we have a IRCB Christmas party or something, all of you are probably getting One Piece Volume 1.
Okay, there we go.
I'll shell out for that.
So, I guess thanks to Viz, you have the ability of marathoning it all at once, or at least 100 chapters, but if you wanted, you could just, start with one, and I know Renee's saying you probably couldn't just read One Piece, you'd have to keep going, but...
Yeah, it's a funny who's on first type joke there with One Piece. So,
you could read only One Piece. If you got it just for One Piece... If you got the Shonen Jump thing or the Viz thing just for One Piece, I would still say that's a pretty good investment.
Now, doesn't One Piece tend to get a lot of attention as well because it's sort of and again, this is like a very much outside looking in on what I know about manga. Isn't it really one of the last big mangas that's still kind of going? Like, nothing ongoing right now really comes close in terms of issue count, right? There's nothing even close to contending anymore.
In Shonen Jump, no. So One Piece is the last of the big three that has been published, the big three being Naruto, One Piece, and Bleach, because they took the top 3 spots for about 10 years in Shonen Jump.
Right.
But One Piece is also one of the like best-selling manga around the world. It's very recognizable. Basically the biggest series since Dragon Ball. And it's still at the top, and it's at the top by a long shot. So I mean, Nick, you are pretty much right. But at the same time, like JoJo's and Berserk, and Hunter still bring a lot of views and votes and whatnot. But I mean, JoJo's and what was the other one I said? JoJo's and Berserk are in different magazines.
Yeah.
So, but those series have been going on for 30 years, and One Piece just celebrated its 20th, I think.
I mean, I've heard of it. It must be a popular manga if even I've heard of it.
Right,
so,
right,
yeah. As for me, this week, I'm excited for Money Shot #1. This is a new series from Vault Comics, written by Tim Seeley and Sarah Beatty, art by Rebecca Isaacs, and colors by Kurt Michael Russell. I'm assuming that's not the Kurt Russell. I'm assuming the Michael's there to make that distinction clear.
You never know. People branch out in weird ways.
That, if Kurt Russell wants to color comics, God love him for doing it. Anyway, this book is about a group of scientists who are, in the near future, they're trying to raise money for their research into teleportation devices, some space travel technology, and funds are low. And they sort of decide that the best way to raise money for these projects is to meet aliens from other planets and film adult films with them. So they're making space porn to raise money for their scientific research. I don't know. This book looks really fun. I think Tim Seeley's a really good writer, and I think he can have a fun spin on this stuff. And it looks like it's going to be, more than just, naughty bits. There's going to be some exploration into, technology and funding and relationship stuff. You have a group of people navigating alien sex, apparently, and obviously it can be decidedly adults only. So some good body humor involved. I think Vault overall has been pretty good at curating a variety of different titles. I mean, all their books are very different, and they're dipping their toes into space porn, I guess, is kind of appealing to me in some regards. So.
Yeah. I mean, you can show up for the space porn, Paul. That's fine. I'm here for the perils of acquiring research funding. Like that's
okay, right?
That's what I connect with.
Cut out all the nudity. Just give me the accounting bits, right?
Yeah.
I'm still
the perils of the tenure track and all of that. That's what I'm interested in.
Right, balancing the spreadsheets as opposed to getting under the bed sheets.
Oh hey-oh.
I'm still looking at dipping my toe into space porn. Oh.
I think that's the title. I think that might be the title of the episode. Yeah, I don't know. This looks like a pretty fun book. I'm excited for it. Like I said, looks decidedly adults only. But if you don't mind some ribald humor, I guess check it out. Money Shot #1. So
yeah.
With that said, we'll take a short break while Rene collects himself, and then we will come back for this episode's main topic, which is the issue of recoloring old comics. We'll be back shortly with that. For this week's main topic, we are going to be talking about recoloring comics, and it might seem like a small issue, but it's really not. There's a lot of pros and cons to it, and it becomes a more important topic as we move into more comics being consumed digitally, recoloring old comics and what that entails, and if it changes the reading experience. So we're going to discuss all of this, or most of it. So I'm just going to maybe start by opening up the discussion group here and see if you have any initial thoughts about this recoloring process and whether it's important or not.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the overall TLDR consensus is that It's not like an absolute, yes, recoloring all the time, always recommended, always preferred, always makes things better, right? And on the flip side, although I definitely have a place where I stand, but people have definitely argued the case that you should never do it, right? That you're never going to improve things. You're creating an act of erasure, basically.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's almost like the controversy surrounding colorized movies. You know, if you remember back when Ted Turner was proposing to do that on TMC, whatever, Turner Classic, TCM, Turner Classic Movies. Like, he bought all the rights to black and white films to air them on his cable channel, and like, he was going to recolor or colorize all these old black and white movies. And, you know, film fans were shocked and, horrified by that prospect, because it would radically change the reading experience or the viewing experience. So Nick, maybe very briefly, if you could maybe summarize some of the arguments, the arguments against any type of recoloring. I mean, what exactly is, because I'm of two minds on it. I think it's warranted in some cases and not in others, but what would be sort of like a common argument against it?
Well, certainly one of them is that the idea of recoloring, basically, as I kind of hinted at earlier, is sort of an act of erasure. It's kind of a covering up in some ways to say, oh, well, that never happened, right? And if you're someone who's concerned about kind of the history of the medium, flaws and all, warts and all, you don't want that happening. Like, I remember reading something about how, generally speaking, first, we talk a lot about how comics are unique in that they're, one, a collaborative medium, which of course means more variables, which means the potential for more mistakes. And it's a collaborative medium that's on a timeline most of the time. It's on a pretty tight timeline. And so mistakes happen, quote unquote mistakes happen, but they're part and parcel of what comics are, you know? Mm-hmm. And so to try to cover that up is kind of destroys part of what makes the medium what it is. And yeah, I've read some people saying, well, what's the harm when your colorist from the 60s is trying to follow a color guide and he accidentally, Wolverine is supposed to have a glove and he accidentally paints the hand a skin tone and now he's no longer wearing one of his gloves. What's the harm in going back and fixing that? And I understand where people are coming from when they say, oh, it was such a dumb, inconsequential mistake and it's kind of looks glaringly stupid. Why wouldn't you just try to, fix that? Yeah. And when you fix that, you sort of, Wolverine looks correct now, but you're also removing that characteristic that these sort of things happened. You're erasing an event in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And, coloring is one of those things that I think, thankfully, in the past, couple decades, it's become more recognized as such an integral part of the medium. But yeah, in the 60s and 70s, it was kind of an afterthought. People were very good at it, but like you said, they're following the color guide. There wasn't as much of a sort of, it wasn't viewed as being as artistic, as an important artistic component as it clearly is. That makes sense? So to that argument, recoloring, when they digitize old comics and they have to maybe update the colors or fix mistakes, I think that it's a continuation of that mentality. Maybe that's the same argument that you're sort of paraphrasing there, is that it's a continuation of this idea that the coloring is just a sort of necessary evil, so to speak. It's the last step in the process, and it's clearly an important one because when it doesn't work, it's very noticeable, but maybe you lose sort of the nuance or the unique personalities that those colorists had when they were doing that back in the 60s,
And one of the arguments, of course, I've seen for when is it okay to recolor, I see is that if you're going to do that, you need to at least consult the original creative team.
Exactly.
Now, the tricky thing, as you were getting at, is that what's being recolored prominently? Well, it's a lot of 60s comics. It's a lot of 50s and 60s comics, where in a lot of situations, you probably don't even have the luxury of getting a hold of one person who's on that creative team. So then it begs the question, well, what do you do in that situation, right? And then Marvel says, "We make money, you big dingus. We're publishing the book."
Right.
I was actually going to say that, but I think Nick put it more eloquently than I could.
Yeah, that brings to mind one of the big examples that made me think of this topic when I proposed it was a few years ago when DC re-released a trade collection of Batman Year One to coincide with the animated film that they put out. They had the book, they printed the new trade on glossy paper, which the original trade collection from the late 80s and when it was reprinted in the 90s, it was always on matte paper. And then the color files that they used for the new reprint were sort of corrupted, or they weren't as focused as the original files. So when that book came out, David Mazzucchelli actually was telling people that he was telling fans not to buy the new version of the book. He said, yeah, this new Batman Year One trade collection, it completely obscures the original coloring that Richmond Lewis did on Year One, and it completely changes the look of the book. So that's an example of recoloring a book without the guidance of the creative team, and it fundamentally changes the book to the point where the creative team is saying, yeah, don't buy it. It's not worth my royalties for you to have an inferior version of the story, And I think that, I have Year One. I think I have a collection that was printed in the early 2000s, and it's still on the matte paper. It has the original coloring, but I guess whatever edition came out, I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago, was viewed as being basically an inferior version of the comic. So I think that was really interesting. And in fact, if I remember correctly, I think Richmond Lewis actually recolored the comic for the original trade collection back in the late 80s. So that's kind of the definitive version of the book, and any type of recoloring is, in fact, a sort of erasure of his hand coloring that he did for that first collection.
I literally was just about to pick up. I was in Best Buy the other day, and they were doing they're selling the movie with the trade, but it was a seal. Yeah. It was sealed so that you couldn't just take out the DVD or leave the trade or whatever. I don't know who would do that, some monster or something. But I was I wanted to know what version of it, because I knew that there were different versions based on the coloring and whatnot, and also the paper. So I was like, I can't tell what this trade is going to be like, so I don't want to get it and just maybe have this thing. And I guess that was the first time I've really kind of really thought about consciously thought about how picky I am with trades, and especially if they're older comic books and how they've been distributed or how they've been packaged.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because I do think that I haven't seen this recolored one, but it must have been pretty glaringly different to have the penciler say, "Don't buy it." What I mean? And it also raises the question of recoloring comics and reprinting them with a different paper stock. A lot of those old comics weren't colored with glossy paper in mind. The colors were designed for newsprint or matte paper, and they don't translate well to glossy paper. So I think it's interesting that DC, again, over the past few years, when they've been recollecting the 70s stuff that Kirby did, a lot of the trade collections are on matte paper. It's not glossy paper at all, and it really captures the original colors a lot better than any glossy paper reprint would. So it's stuff you don't really think about until you're actually holding the physical copy. And you see it, right?
I just did something similar with Infinity War and The Return of Superman. I saw that they had, even though it was a new edition, it was a reprint, they had still stuck to the matte paper, and it kind of still also had I remember, seeing single issues of this when I was a kid, and it's got that same vibe. And it's if it had the glossy, I don't know if I would have been interested in buying it, which I guess shows my own bias towards recoloring.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the larger issue we keep coming back to, is this idea that any type of change feels like, it's really, you want to have an experience as close to the original as you can. Mm-hmm. I guess what I'm trying to say, right? The same experience as someone who bought Year One off the rack, the individual issues when it came out, you kind of want that same experience, I think, if you're going back to a classic book like that. So
yeah, and I wonder if it's just because I like this style, or I like that, or it's you want to recapture the feeling you had when you first read that story as well.
Yeah. There's something about the aesthetic of a comic book in the 80s that I think is a part of the reading it. Even if you're reading it now, 30 years down the road, you kind of want to have that same experience. You know, it's I don't know, it's an intangible thing. Again, like I said, you only really notice it or think about it till you actually have the book in your hand. So, speaking to that, there's another example I have where a few years ago, DC did a collection of Flex Mentallo. So they collected the Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely story in a really nice hardcover collection. The book had been out of print for years and years due to legal issues, but they recolored it, and they recolored it with a very modern, contemporary color palette. And it's not that the book is that old. I think Flex Mentallo came out in very late 90s, early 2000s, but even that, 15, 16 year gap, the paper stock and the coloring technology changed enough where they were able to recolor it, but they gave it such a muted color palette that the book, the originals are vibrant and colorful, and the deluxe edition, it's very muddy looking, and it really changes the way the story feels, right? It looks bleak at moments where the original is sort of bright and colorful, and it's really off-putting. Again, I bought the collector's edition, and I was reading it, and I this looks different. And then, I pulled out my original copies, and yeah, sure enough, this is a radically different book due to the recoloring. And I even remember there being a controversy. There's one scene where in the original Flex Mentallo, there's one panel where you see some people at a party, and they have a darker skin complexion, and in the reprint, they've lightened the skin complexion of those characters. They're people in the background. They're not important characters. They're just background people standing there, but it's very strange that you'd recolor something to that degree where, the skin tone is different for these random characters. It felt like a weird choice. So I guess what I'm saying, if you get your hands on the original Flex Mentallo issues, do that instead. So those are the examples I have of coloring not working, but obviously there are examples where it does work, or it might be an important choice to make.
Yeah, because didn't Neil Gaiman do that with Sandman? They recolored it, but he colored it the way he wanted to. Am I remembering that right?
You sort of have the right idea. And again, this is how I understand it. So when the versions of the Absolute Sandman started rolling out in 06, and those are those massive $150 volumes.
Yeah.
There was sort of an effort to recolor and most specifically recolor the first 18 issues, or basically the first 3 volumes at least, because as Gaiman wrote, basically he said, that with production changing and improving, that he really didn't. Yeah, the original technology means that with every new printing on cleaner paper with sharper inks, it looks worse. There was never the time or the money to fix anything in the old days, and stuff simply went out as it was, sometimes to the detriment of the story. Now, again, I don't totally agree with Gaiman in the sense that, there were imperfections, but that's just what happened, and that's not something you can kind of wash over, right? But the fact that they brought back one of the original colorists to do it, and the fact that, at least from their argument in this article by Comics Alliance, they said that actually improving the color to more precision rather than just, I don't remember the term for when they sort of just kind of generically color just a whole area, that it actually makes the pencils pop out better. That the color isn't just sort of washing over it just completely. So, I don't know. It's tricky stuff. I think one of the perfect examples of how messy of an issue can this be, right, is The Killing Joke by Alan Moore and Brian Boland, right? So Boland, decades later, decides that he's going to recolor the book, or maybe someone from DC gets on the phone and says, do you want some money? Who knows exactly how it played out, but at least from what I've heard, there was some agency on Boland's part, and he was eager to recolor it. He did not actually do the colors the first time around. It was John Higgins, I believe. And so, what do you do when someone from the creative team wants to have this revision, and what comes out is a very different looking book, much like your Flex Mentallo. It's muted grays and browns versus bright reds and pinks and things like this. And I think ultimately seemingly a lot of this recoloring is frequently a shift from more impressionistic color choices, largely sometimes based on limitations, to literal choices, which is interesting. Matt Wilson, in an article for Comics Alliance called "Is a Recolored Comic Still the Same Comic?" he wrote that he thinks some recolorings are too literal. They're committed to making things the colors that they would really be, rather than something more abstract that sets a mood, something old comics coloring had in spades, possibly to make up for limited options, right?
Yeah, that's a good example. And as we're talking about this, I keep thinking that instead of recoloring comics from the say 50s and 60s and 70s, there might be a good argument to be made that maybe we should be recoloring those books from the early 90s to mid 90s where they're experimenting with digital coloring, and the experiments didn't quite work. I read a lot of bad early image books where they're experimenting with computer coloring and digital coloring, and that thing where you almost have too many options and too many tools in your toolbox where you overthink stuff. Having that stuff sort of stripped down and put back in a more sort of subtle or simplified manner might be more appealing than recoloring The Killing Joke or Batman Year One, for example.
Oh yeah, totally. The hard part there is, I think, asking if people want to reread those 90s books. I think that's where the rubber meets the road. But
is there a big demand for some some absolute editions of Prophet, or Youngblood? I don't know. But yeah, I think what's really interesting is that the idea that it only really works if you're able to consult the original colorist or someone that was involved with it, right? The idea that if you're simply recoloring something just to do it, that makes the colorist's job feel inconsequential or interchangeable. But when you're able to approach a creator and say, we want to do a new edition of this book, what is going to serve the story the best in your eyes? That seems like an acceptable way around that issue. And another issue here that I see in our notes is that books that were originally in black and white, which I think is an even more interesting topic, the desire to republish black and white comics in full color for reasons other than just selling another copy of the book, right? What's the impetus for recoloring something like Scott Pilgrim or Bone that has been published in color, or From Hell? What is the desire to go back and revisit those books in color? I'm not quite sure I buy their necessity. Or buy the books, so to speak.
Right. And obviously the no-brainer answer, of course, is, well, the real cynical one is it's another excuse to resell the book, right?
Right.
The slightly less cynical one would be that color sells, and that with younger audiences, with younger readers, with newer readers, color helps, right? If you try to sit a kid down in front of a TV these days and make them watch a black and white TV show or a black and white movie, that's, for better or for worse, not going to help your case,
Right. Yeah.
And I think for a lot of these publishers, they're like, yeah, we would love for people to reread Thor, but with those colors or whatever, it's not going to happen. Or, publishers have made this decision decades ago, when DC got their hands on V for Vendetta and they republished it.
Yeah, it's true.
They went ahead, I think from Rebellion Comics was the name, Rebellion Magazine or whatever that was. They just went right ahead and just recolored that when they did it. So, just colored it, period. They didn't recolor it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting too, because there have been a lot of comics that I've read in black and white, but when you see the color versions, it doesn't quite feel right. I'm thinking of buying those big phone book sized collections that DC did, like the showcase collections where it's printed on the cheap newsprint and it's all black and white, but they're black and white reprints of comics that are originally in color. But the way I read them the first time was in black and white. But when I find the original issues and flip through it, I'm like, this feels really different in color. It's such a different reading experience. That feels more of a radical change than just simply recoloring a book with updated technology, right? The shift from black and white to color is a huge leap in my mind.
Yeah, and sometimes it feels almost, it feels like you're almost like watching or like you're reading something completely different. Like it's, I always get the feeling that it's like I'm reading someone's coloring book. Like that's how I felt about the colored Scott Pilgrim, which is why I didn't buy it. Because I was just like, I don't know if I wholeheartedly agree with these colors, and that's a personal thing, though. Yeah. But I really, and this is probably just because of the amount of manga that I read. I really like black and white, but also a lot of the time the original shading in the black and white story will get taken out, or they'll change it to a different color, and it sort of changes the tone of the panel when you take just that initial shading or that inking, and it's not just black or like empty white, and it becomes like a blue or like a magenta, and you're like, well, that was a really interesting choice. I know that there's a manga that I read, Hajime no Ippo, which is a boxing manga, and the artist does all these huge sweeping movements of following where the boxers are punching, and shows the effect that it has on the air around them and whatnot. And if it was colored, like how would you mix like the way that the wind swirls around the glove or around their punch or around the mat itself? Like how do you transition that to be in color when technically like it's just wind? It should be see-through. Do you do the background or whatnot? It just kind of loses something in the storytelling. It goes from being able to feel that power to just kind of like, and that's a punch.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that kind of speaks to why I wanted to bring this topic up to discuss. Why I think that a lot of artists, they're working within limitations. If you're working on a small budget and you can't afford color, that's going to dictate a lot of your artistic choices when you're drawing the book, right? So to translate that to color, that feels like a big change. And if the artist themselves is cool with that and they oversee it, like I'm sure that this recolored From Hell that Eddie Campbell's doing, like I'm sure it's interesting. But the original artwork was designed to be in black and white. So the choices he made originally, like
with like
are they
pen,
going to be fundamentally
like really
changed?
thin pen too,
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever read any Eddie Campbell work that's in color. I think everything I've ever read by him is in black and white. I can't even imagine what it'd look like in color. So I'm cautiously curious about this recolored From Hell, in that regard.
Yeah. It's always interesting when it's something's drawn because they know it's going to be in black and white, and then someone tries to color it, especially if they've molded their style to sort of fit that. Like the author for Yu Yu Hakusho, and we were just talking about him in between the break, but so he falls ill a lot just from his business and from what he does, and I think just he's got health issues just in general. But he actually worked that into his drawing style, where his backgrounds are very minimalistic, so that he can just be like, what, I just need to focus on this one thing. We're not going to even worry about it. But he moved his style around that. And so it's like you have a lot of these just kind of blank backgrounds that fit the tone of the book in black and white. And then when you watch the anime, you're like, why is there just a green color behind him? Why is it just
right? Yeah.
And it doesn't like hurt the story at all necessarily, but it still feels off because it wasn't originally meant to transition that way, even though animes are often meant to be in color.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting topic, and it's hard to really put your finger on it because color feels like it's an intangible thing, because when it works, you don't really notice it. When it works well, you don't quite, it doesn't stand out. It only really stands out when it's, radically different or bad. So, so I think it's an interesting topic, and I think we've kind of come down on squarely on the fence on this one, right? Because sometimes there's examples when it's a bad choice to recolor a book, and there's other examples where I think it's the right choice. So I guess it comes down to the book itself and the creators themselves making that decision, and we as readers, whether we want to buy it or not. So
yeah, and I think there's no harm in buying both or even reading both. Like I know that, and this isn't a comic book, but it's a comic book movie. Logan, the film, had both a color version and they had a black and white version. And I mean, granted, it came all on one disc, and if only we were so lucky, it was like, hey, just buy one trade. It's got both versions. But I don't think there's anything wrong with purchasing it and looking at it, and just being like, oh, that's a thing. I mean, again, unless like, if the original creators are offended by it, like with the Batman Year One, in which case I'll be like, maybe support, if you feel like it, support the artist that you respect.
Yeah. I'm now thinking of more examples, like when DC did the, reprinted Batman Hush that was just Jim Lee's pencils, or I have a book of, Kirby comics that have been republished when you just see the inks and pencils without any color, and it's more of a sort of interesting experiment rather than a replacement for the original comic in my eyes, if that makes sense. It's just, here's another take on this. I'm looking at it as a sort of coffee table book or an art book as opposed to reading the comic as I did originally.
Right. And I've even seen a couple comics where they're like, hey, it's like a coloring book version, but it's the actual comic. It's like, but you can color it the way you want to, which I feel is a very dangerous thing.
Sure. But, yeah. Nick, do you have any final thoughts to wrap up before we call it quits here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the biggest thing that worries me about all of this, and we've just kind of touched on it a little, is that you can say, oh, you can like the new version, you can like the old version. What worries me is the fact that some people are just going to be not even aware that what they're seeing is changed or revised. Right. That to some people, they're completely unaware that there are two versions, that this is a revised version or whatever. None of these books seem to really ever go out of their way and say, oh, it didn't originally look like this, or this book has been remastered. It just says Batman Year One, and to the average reader or whatever, that's what they were recommended or whatever, and that's what they're going to go pick up, and so they're none the wiser. And so, yeah, I mean, I understand why Marvel says, oh, we're going to remaster Howard Chaykin's run on Star Wars, and we're going to make Darth Vader have black armor because green and blue is goofy and the kiddos aren't going to like that. But for me, it's so bizarre. I just, I'm not going to put up with that. That's for sure. I don't know if you've seen this. I don't know if you've seen this. This is probably what caused the last big recoloring debacle was Chaykin's Star Wars, but it's terrible. Yeah. Give me green Darth Vader every day of the week. Like,
there's a reason that it's colored that way originally. It's an artistic choice, and but I think that people that are passionate about comics are aware of that. Like, I feel like people that, are devoted consumers and really care about the medium as an art form are going to seek out the original, right? Are going to be aware of the changes. So, I just think it's an interesting topic because it feels like a minor thing, but it does, like I keep saying, radically change your experience of the comic. And it's something I find myself thinking about a lot when I'm reading older comics that have been recolored.
Yeah, and it's weird because we're not having this conversation about having someone re-inking a book. We're not having this conversation about giving a penciler the same script and redrawing a whole book, right? Like, those aren't conversations we're having. We're largely just having this conversation about recoloring a book, and I think that says a lot about what people think about colorists. I think implicitly that says a lot.
It does, definitely. And I think it's an opinion that's changing. I think, like I said earlier, the attitude toward the importance of the colorist is something that's become more respected for a lot of creators and a lot of publishers. So I'm going to wrap things up here, and I'm going to just ask the listeners that if they have any other examples of recolored comics that they want to share with us, they can do that. And there's a number of ways they can contact us. Twitter is a big one. We're all on there. Nick is at Death Star Plans. Rene is at Rodriguer29, and I am at Paulie. And of course, the show itself is on Twitter at IRCB Podcast, where we share comic book news, art, and a variety of other things.
We would love it if you would go ahead and subscribe on Patreon. That's at patreon.com/IRCB podcast. Without your support, this show wouldn't survive. If you join now, you can get access to exclusive audio, articles, previews of our schedule, early access to Top of My Pile posts. You can get your episode a whole day early, and so much more. There's also our Goodreads group. It's a lovely community of comic friends, and we have weekly threads. One of this week's threads is 80s vibes and cartoon nostalgia, which Kara posted, involving 80s cartoons and the comics that they bring to mind. You can check that out at ircbpodcast.com/Goodreads.
Head over to ircbpodcast.com for a pronunciation guide, Discord server, zines, merch, and everything else IRCB. If you haven't already, please rate and review our show on iTunes and all the other places that you're maybe listening to us. And you know what? Maybe we'll read your review on our next episode. You can email the show with what you've been reading, recipes, corrections, and anything else at ircbpodcast@gmail.com.
Infinity Shred is the best band in the world. They also happen to do the music for our show. Xander, he invokes the feeling of catching the bus the minute it arrives and finding the perfect seat for that 45-minute commute you had ahead of you. He also edits the show. Thank you to Nick and Rene for joining me. Thank you to Mike for letting me, tossing me the keys to the car, so to speak, and letting me drive this podcast off the cliff. Until next time, thank you to the listeners. Until next time, comics are good, and so are you.
I was really thrown by the Xander feeling of catching the bus.
I really didn't. I mean, I get what he's getting at, but it's really difficult to read that. Say it.
I know that's a really. That was like that's a Mike rapping ramble. That is like something only the rapping can pull. And I'm just like, what? I also just wonder if he runs these by Xander first, and if Xander's like, I don't know if I agree with that.
Oh, I don't think he does. I think if he tried, Xander would completely shut all that shit down for sure. Yeah.
Oh.